Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to join this panel. And I'm Todd Shaw again. And we have a tradition of NCOBPS of talking about being among the family of NCOBPS. So it's a great pleasure to be among friends and family. At this time, I'm just going to say a few words about other dimensions of the gender gap. My fellow panelists have said some brilliant things with regards to one dimension of gender, but I want to bring in other dimensions of gender with regards to the question of the black male problem, the quote unquote black male problem. I'm putting quotes around that, and the black vote. And I'm showing you two pictures here that I think represent the continuum or the aspects of the continuum of power in Black politics. On the left side of your screen is Representative David Bowen, who is a state representative in Milwaukee. And he talked about how Joe Biden could win conceivably with a slightly smaller margin of African-American men voting than true of African-American women. But there is a important dynamic we know in this election of the need for, given all of the barriers to be confronted, that there is a fundamental need for every vote to be counted and every vote to be harnessed. And then on the left side is 24-year-old Mr. Kenny Pascal, who in an interview with the New York Times said he wanted to vote, he would vote, and thinks he might be missing out on something. But he is facing the prospect of not being permitted to vote because of the felony conviction laws within his state. And so the continuum from state representative to young man who seeks to vote, but is nabbed in this structure of systemic racism that confront Black women and men. So I think I wanted to just sort of say my comments relative to a fact that has been much discussed and I'm drawing upon your comments to think a little bit more about comments I might put into writing. And that fact is that if you take a look at some of the validated voter surveys or possibly exit polls, that they revealed 14% of Black men said they voted for candidate Trump in 2016. And of course, this is interesting, but as you've seen from our previous presenters, this is in context with the fact that within the African-American community and African-American women, so overwhelmingly voted for the Democratic candidate. And if you look across this data I got from Pew relative to all other sort of race, gender intersections, that Black men next to Black women are the least likely to vote for candidate Trump. Now, Rashawn Ray, who is at the Brookings Institute, pulled this apart by saying, at least from his analysis, those Black male Trump voters were more highly educated, conservative, and religious. And so they had some of the same traits, if you will, that ideologically might fall along the lines of those who are voting for Trump more broadly. Thanks to the 2016 CMPS, and I'm gonna give a shout out to someone who I was her teacher in college, but she's now my mentor, which is Lori Frazier, and her co-authors, or excuse me, our co-principal investigators with the CMPS. We have this wonderful data. And so I'm looking at just sort of two questions of which have already been referenced. One is in the election of president, who would you vote for? And I show you sort of the margins for Black men and Black women, which are overwhelming margins for Hillary Clinton. But whereas Black women, there's a 9% difference of more Black women voting for Hillary Clinton. Much smaller numbers as reported in validated surveys in this survey of Black men and women voting for candidate Trump, although Black men outnumber Black women 2-to-1 in that small margin. Likewise, with those favorability ratings that Dr. Frazier has already referenced, Hillary Clinton, 78% of African-American women had a favorable or somewhat or very favorable view of Hillary Clinton. Similarly, Black men, very high levels at 71%, which was about a 7% difference rounded up, but with candidate Trump, 10% of Black women and 17% of Black men, again, that represented that difference of about a negative 7.1 points when you subtract the Black men's rate for Black women's rate. So there is this sense that the, African-American women, both in their policy progressivism and in the progressivism of their vote, there is a margin of difference between them and their African-American male counterparts. And as Laurie has also referenced, this is not, you really can't get at this ideologically. You have to look at these intersections of race, gender, and the ways in which African-American men and women, I would suggest, plug into various social networks that inspire and mobilize their organization, their leadership, their vote. And so it's not just a matter that ideologically you can sort this out, because there aren't these sort of whopping differences, again, CNPS data would say between African-American men and women who self-identify as liberal, moderate, or conservative. Again, this is just another cut at previous discussions with Dr. Dow and Dr. Frazier. And so we look at this overall question of the gender gap between men and women voters, and we see the gender gap from the standpoint of turnout, that there are sort of, at least going back to Reagan and Carter, you had sort of, or actually to the Reagan-Mondale race of '84, you had a higher percentage and then a persistently higher percentage of women turning out as compared to their male counterparts. This, however, gap, again, as referenced previously, is larger among African-American women and men. And you can see essentially these lines work in tandem. And we see this period, of course, in the 2000s, the 21st century, of this line of turnout going up for both groups. And so we should think about both this question of African-American men and women's standpoint, but how being connected to a community in some ways brings about sort of a similar connections within institutions, even given that African-American women participate at higher levels across the board, and particularly within voting. I also sort of just pulled some data from that related to college students and the tough university studies across universities, college students. And when we compared 2012 to 2016 presidential turnout, we see these increases across all groups, but we saw this sort of 5% difference in turnout among younger African-Americans or African-American college students, which mirrored what was true of African-Americans, if you go back to my previous slide, or think about the previous slide, which mirrored that downturn in turnout from 2016 to 2012 among African-Americans overall. Let's keep in mind, however, that still even in 2016, you still had a large average turnout for African-Americans, even given that downturn. And so if you take 2016 and compare it to the 1990s, you have a very different picture than if you compared it just as a 21st century phenomenon. And then we also, one thing I sort of pose to our thinking is 2020 is 2020 going to be like 2018 or like 2016? The 2016, the downturn in African-American turnout for the reasons that we will unpack later, versus 2018, whereas 2018 as a midterm election, as you all know very well, saw sort of this record increase across the board. I mean, you have to go back to 1914 in order to have the similar rate of a midterm turnout 104 years ago, to have the same level of turnout that you saw in this blue wave of 2018. And again, looking at this data as related to college students, you saw these sort of increases or upticks among African-American men and African-American women with regards to the percentage turnout. And even given that you saw sort of Latinx women having the higher rates, African-American women who were college students were not far behind, and African-American men clearly had doubled their rate from 2014 to 2018. And what will be the sort of driver, if you will, even given again, the ways in which African-American women, young and across the board, are turning out in higher rates. Now, I won't get far into this because I want to not do that professor thing and go over time. But I will just sort of reference, because I know there's actually brilliant minds on this, all on this panel and in the audience whose work speak directly to this, whether it be this question of the carceral state and questions of carceral citizenship, and the ways in which this has a gendered aspect to it. You know, I'm just sort of briefly referencing the work of Uggins, Ryan, and Shannon, of the 6.1 million Americans who are forbidden to vote because of felony disenfranchisement. We know how this directly impacts African Americans. The imprisonment rate for African American women being twice their white female counterparts, and almost 3 times for men, given their black men for their black or their white male counterparts. We know what's happening in Florida, with even given the passage of the amendment that had some restoration of the franchise to formerly incarcerated individuals. We know the court rulings that have halted that process because of the stipulation of having to pay court and other fees that created economic barriers. We also know of efforts going on in terms of voter purges across the states, and particularly in states like Ohio, that have had court sanction, and the gendered way this may have an impact, particularly when you have African-American men having higher rates at which they don't consistently vote across elections, and thus may be susceptible to purges. And then I'm going to argue that a direct appeal to the needs of African-American men and women and African-American communities can also have a suppressive effect on the vote, and particularly of African-American men in the dimension of the talk I'm highlighting here. Again, I'm referencing Rashawn Ray's work from the Brookings Institute that talks about the sort of the particular economic segregation and discrimination African-American men confront, and in what ways does this show up in the economic disadvantages that have an impact upon political mobilization. Drug arrests and drug prosecution being higher, but the ways in which the economic disadvantage of being involved in and being capitalized in the hemp industry is the other end of the continuum that faces African American men in particular, but African American communities and women in particular as well. I'm gonna jump forward a bit, but I will say very briefly, there's a Center for American Progress, a research piece that I'll just briefly reference here, in saying that the 2012 rates of turnout were similar to, the 2016 rates were similar to 2012 rates, the long and short of it would be candidate Clinton would have won that election. And these battleground states that they made these simulations and these calculations in convey that set of predictions. So let me just conclude by saying that around this question of mobilization, there is this sort of discussion about the mobilization of black male, of the black male vote, of the Black Male Voter Project, and Amplify Action are just 2 among other organizations trying to get at this question of black male voters. I want to raise the question very similar as a parallel to Dr. Frazier's question of the critical way in which we do not ask this as a zero-sum game. The ways in which you sort of mobilize the black male vote as though it is in a separate question for African-American women, given the social networks, community networks, family networks that individuals find themselves, and of course the sexism as a layered aspect upon which African-American women confront, particularly in this election and particularly within their individual lives. And then what are the interests and these that will be mobilized? And are there particular interests that are the when and where I enter interest? Are there ways in which we can make an argument that if you understand these interests that directly confront African-American women, you see the broader interest of a community? And that's not to say it doesn't speak to African-American men's interest, but they are not in diametric opposition to each other. And so I want to broaden that question of mobilization as an important parallel to what African-American men and African-American women confront. Thank you.